and you return it to pawn.
Lefroy was a regular customer at the pawnbrokers. He'd pledged an overcoat there for 10 shillings. He'd got more than £1 for his dress suit, and he'd received another 5 shillings for a 6-chambered revolver. On the morning of the 27th of June, Lefroy came to get his pistol back.
Well, someone who was using pawn shops to quite the excessive degree that Lefroy was is suggestive of rather a roguish, shadowy figure.
We're not talking about lots of money, we're talking about 5 shillings or £1 or 10 shillings, tiny sums of money, all of which help him exist on a sort of a day-to-day basis.
It suggests someone who's on the margins of deprivation, who doesn't have a secure, solid, respectable, grounded existence, which is what the Victorians told people they should aspire to.
Lefroy returned to London Bridge. He bought a first-class ticket for Brighton. In the waiting room, under cover of a newspaper, he loaded his gun. It was nearly 2 o'clock. The Brighton express train was getting ready to depart when Lefroy hurried down the platform.
They're all individual compartments in those days, so you couldn't get on at one part of the train and walk down the corridor to find who you were looking for.
He'd hoped to commit a robbery without violence, that simply waving the pistol in the face of some timid commuter would enable him to commit a robbery and get away with it. But it was so ill thought through.
He spotted a man sat alone in a first-class compartment. He was eating strawberries. Lefroy climbed in. 2 minutes later, the train pulled out of London Bridge Station. And soon, row after row of tightly packed streets were flashing by the window. But faced with the reality of what he had planned, Lefroy faltered. Every time he glanced at the man seemed to stare back. Lefroy grew nervous.
The man was looking at him in a peculiar way. Well, Percy Lefroy Mapleton was a bit odd himself. Now, we know subsequently from other evidence that the man was George Austin. Now, Lefroy thinks from the man's stares that he knows that Lefroy is going to attack him, is going to kill him. He becomes frightened. What he doesn't know is that Austin is staring at him because Austin is incredibly short-sighted. And he's staring at him to try and focus, but Lefroy completely misinterprets it.
Lefroy could bear it no longer. At East Croydon, he got out. And further down the train, he saw another man sitting alone in another first-class compartment. He was dozing with a handkerchief over his head. Lefroy reboarded the train. This time, he told himself, he wouldn't hesitate. If dear Violet was to be his, now was the time for courage. The train accelerated to its top speed of 50 miles an hour. It whistled into the darkness of Merstham Tunnel. The train sped on south. Soon it rattled past the cottage of Anne Brown in Hawley. Through the windows of her front room, Mrs. Brown and her daughter had a clear view of the passengers inside.
According to the 2 women, they were watching the trains go by, just passing an idle hour.
They thought they saw 2 men fighting together in one of the compartments.
It's very difficult to know for certain, but I suspect that they at least saw something, the beginnings of an attack.
The train was soon approaching the outskirts of Brighton. At 3:20 p.m, it pulled into Preston Park Station, 1.5 miles north of the town centre. Waiting on the platform was ticket collector Richard Gibson. As the train slowed, he saw a man leaning out of a first-class compartment, beckoning to him.
Immediately, he saw something wrong because he wasn't wearing a hat. All men wore hats. And not only did he have no hat, but he was covered in blood.
He was in a very physically shaken state. He was in a very mentally shaken state.
When they looked at him, they looked at his feet, and from his shoe, they could see that there was a gold chain. So the ticket collector pulled on the gold chain, and then came out a gold watch from his shoe. He said, "Well, what's this?" And Percy Lefroy Mapleton said, "Well, I don't know anything about this." Later on, he claims that it was his watch and chain which he'd actually put into his shoe for safekeeping.
I think he was just in a state of shock, a state of panic, and he never subsequently achieved real clarity.
Another ticket collector and the station master gathered around Lefroy. He told the railwaymen that he'd been attacked on board, fired at 3 or 4 times, and struck over the head with a blunt instrument. The compartment was covered in blood. There were bullet holes in the cushions, there were bloody fingerprints on the footboard. But there was no sign of the man with the handkerchief. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was a good liar. He always had been. And now found blooded and bruised in a train compartment at Preston Park. He had quite the story to tell.
Initially, the railway staff are puzzled. They can't make any sense of Lefroy's story.
He says that he'd been attacked by 2 men, one a countryman and the other an old gentleman.
He very quickly changes his story so that the elderly gentleman isn't attacking him, it's only the countryman. The elderly gentleman sort of disappears, except that later on he reappears and the countryman disappears briefly, and it is the elderly gentleman who is attacking him.
They saw that he was obviously in a state, so the station master made sure that the ticket collector got back on the train with Percy Lefroy Mapleton, and they took him down the line to Brighton to the end. At Brighton, the police inspector started to question Percy Lefroy Mapleton on exactly what had happened.
As Lefroy was spinning his tale, 20 miles away, a railway platelayer was walking with his nephew through Balcombe Tunnel. Thomas Jennings was employed to inspect and maintain the tracks. With a naphtha lamp to light the way, Jennings walked the length of the soot-black tunnel, eyes peeled for any damage or obstruction. At around 4 p.m, he spotted something.
They saw a bundle, a heap, lying by the side of the track, and initially thought that something had been thrown out of a train window. They get closer and they realise it's a body.
He was obviously dead. They found some correspondence with his name on, and so they could identify him.
The dead man was Frederick Isaac Gold. He was 64 years old and lived with his wife Lydia just a few hundred yards from Preston Park Station. On the 27th of June, Gold had left home early and caught the 8:45 train from Brighton to London Bridge.
It was a regular trip that he took. He had retired to Preston Park. He had spent a long and successful career as a master baker. He'd had a series of shops that in his early 60s he'd sold off.
But he keeps one shop on because he looks on this as potentially as being something which he could hand on to his 14-year-old nephew.
He was not running it on a day-to-day basis, but he still maintained an interest. He was still the big boss. And so he would go up, check that things were well, inspect the takings, and take them home with him.
That morning, there were £38, 5 shillings and a penny, and Gold deposited the money at his bank in Whitechapel and prepared for the trip home. Just before 2 p.m, he took a seat in a first-class compartment on the Brighton Express. Two hours after Gold boarded the train in London, his body was found in Balcombe Tunnel. The fall from the train had inflicted terrible injuries. Gold's skull was crushed and his leg gashed open, but he'd been through an ordeal even before that. A bullet was found in his spine, and the doctors counted 14 different knife wounds on his body. It was clear Frederick Gold had suffered a vicious assault. But news of the discovery in the tunnel didn't reach Brighton immediately. There, police were wondering what to do with the strange young man who'd got off the train at Preston Park.
Because of his blood-stained appearance, they got him taken to hospital and cleaned up. And in fact, the doctors at the hospital sort of clarified that actually he only had very superficial scratches. He didn't have any serious injuries at all.
What they think is that Lefroy had expected to make away with himself in a state of temporary insanity and was still suffering from that.
They gave him to Detective Sergeant George Holmes to accompany back to his lodgings in Wallington.
Lefroy boarded the 6:10 train for London. When the train stopped at Balcombe Station, the detectives heard about the man found dead in the tunnel. But they didn't suspect Lefroy. At East Croydon, they received a telegram asking them to check the serial number of the watch spotted in Lefroy's shoe. The number Lefroy gave didn't match the watch. But still, the police did not suspect him.